Okay, we should be live right now. Are you okay? What
I'm
happened?
okay. I think I've adjusted my light. Yeah.
Okay. I thought I heard something spill, which is not what you
No, no,
want.
no. It was just
We
me
we
drawing.
just started. So say hi to everyone,
Hi,
James.
everyone.
This is none of the above, right? I used to be called "Don't Let It Go Unheard." Now I was going to go into an old routine. Um, I seriously thought you spilled something and it threw me off. Okay, there. So I've got no sound in my ear. We're here. This is with James Valliant, Amy Peikoff. We are doing another None of the Above. This is the third official one. I tried to do a solo one and call it None of the Above, but it's just not the same without you, James. So
Oh, you do it so well without me, though. You don't miss me much.
no, I mean I could talk on privacy forever. You know that, but no, it's
I would enjoy it forever.
better with you. So glad to have you here. Everybody, if you want to look at the program notes, go to don'tletitgo.com and you can check out what I've put there today. Mostly we've got updates on Hong Kong and China. And there's another story that is right up Jim's alley that we need to discuss as well, which is the influence of religion in politics. And as you could tell by the title that we have here for our show, None of the Above, which is basically written after an atheist anthem. We're not very fond of religion and politics over here, so I'm sure that Jim's going to have a lot to say about that. Welcome to everybody who's joining us over at YouTube. I see some people filtering in, and why don't we go ahead and get started over there at don'tletitgo.com. The first thing maybe to talk about is sort of the prospects that either businessmen who are trying to plan long range have for their futures, or if you're one of the people who is hoping to improve your situation in Hong Kong, and in particular try to stave off the takeover, the impending takeover by the Chinese communist regime over there. What are your prospects for getting any, at least moral support, maybe some more substantive support from Donald Trump? And if you look at the sort of statements that he has been making, you have no idea what to expect as far as I can tell. He was at the G7 and he was essentially waffling back and forth. Is that right, Jim?
That's right. And his moral support is sort of tepid at best. When when you hear from Mike Pompeo and from Donald Trump on this, it almost sounds as though they're going to use Hong Kong as leverage for a trade deal. I'm not sure what the priority here is, Hong Kong or a trade deal. Because just today, Trump was saying what a great, marvelous, wonderful guy he is. Really a terrific guy, President Xi of China. And he said when people complained about sort of the nice talk that he gives to authoritarian leaders, he said, that's just my negotiating style. So who knows? He's a total pragmatist, and he's not giving them the moral support I think they deserve in any case. And I feel, at least in my gut, that he's still prepared to wipe his feet on Hong Kong like a doormat to get a deal with his great buddy, President Xi of China.
Yeah, and as far as I can tell, it's basically all for his re-election campaign anyway, right? Um, I have no idea. And then, of course, there was the hereby ordered tweet where he's going to order businesses to basically leave China, start looking at alternatives now. What are you supposed to do if you're trying to plan in the face of this? I've got a number of links, kind of tied to this angle of the story, which is, essentially what is anybody trying to expect? We see China seeing that Trump seems to be weak and waffling on this stuff, and they're ready to jump right in and kind of, capitalize, haha, communize. I'm gonna have a new one on the vulnerability that Trump is showing, right? And then we have the farmers who supposedly Trump has been trying to court as supporters for his campaign, and even they don't know what to expect. I would tell them, the farmers, they seem to be the ones who are the beneficiaries of all the billions that Trump brags about taking in when he's sitting off the top with all these tariffs. But they seem to even be worried about this, is the latest story from the New York Times.
Listening to Iowa soy farmers, it's like 20%, 1 in 5 of their soybeans has been recently sold to mainland China. It's significant business. And but on the face of it, of course, Iowa farmers would tend to be conservative voters. They tend to be in Trump's camp. And so we hear that they're willing to endure a certain amount of pain, especially if they get subsidies from the federal government to cover their losses from the tariff, exactly the kind of behavior Trump complains about with China, subsidies and tariffs. Well, he'll respond with subsidies and tariffs to protect them.
Jim, don't you know it can't actually be a swamp if it's filled with farmers? Right? Swamp is only if it's whoever, Obama was courting.
Right.
But I mean, American farmers, how can you be against American farmers?
Right. Well, yes, their lifestyle, it's the base of the economy and our value system.
Right.
Promote American farming. But the real people who suffer, of course, are going to be the consumers. And it's going to start really kicking in if these huge tariffs continue. Trump waffled. He announced huge tariffs. The stock market tanks. He waffles. The stock market comes back up. There's no question. What we said a couple of weeks ago is exactly right. Trump's trade war is causing volatility in the capital markets, extreme volatility in the capital markets. And his best reply is that America is comparatively in a better place than most of the economies of the world. He knows what's going on in Germany and Europe. He knows what's going on in China itself. And as if their hurting was his achievement. And that
we're hurting less than they are.
Right, exactly. Right. Yeah. Don't worry. I know there'll be pain for Americans, but we're going to hurt less. Isn't that lovely? When we shoot ourselves in the foot, after they shoot themselves in the foot, our injuries will be less. That's his argument.
Yeah. So we should feel better because we're not tanking quite as badly as everybody else. As long as there's another carcass to continue to feed on is the way it's starting to look. No, and I mean it's really bad, right? I didn't want to get to this one yet, but my mind keeps going there. In the program notes, I've got let me see if I can get back over there. Was I over there? I swear I was over there. Oh, probably what I did is I clicked away from it. Sorry. So over at the program notes, don'tletitgo.com, I've got Elizabeth Warren now talking about trying to encourage, as they all talk about, encourage businesses to manufacture and do all of their operations here in America, right? And she's calling it economic patriotism.
In sharp contrast to Trump's economic nationalism.
Right.
Trump is, like I said 2 weeks ago, Trump's kind of outflanked them on the left when it comes to tariffs and trade issues. And he's actually a large part of his appeal to what used to be the Labor Democrat vote, maybe the reason why he got Pennsylvania and Michigan in the last election, was that he sort of took that issue away from them. It was the Republicans who traditionally been, at least in their lip service, pro-free trade. And they were the ones who tried to get these, I don't know the value of them, these international trade agreements that Mr. Trump thinks have so hurt us. His tweet the other day ordering, it wasn't a suggestion, it wasn't a recommendation, it wasn't a please.
I hereby order.
When a president who uses Twitter for official business uses the words "I hereby order," one has to wonder what Trump thinks his own power actually is. He later mentioned an emergency powers law, but he hasn't invoked any emergency powers law. The emergency powers laws that I'm aware of are not, the conditions for enacting them have not been met. He hasn't officially invoked them. He's just ordered them. I hereby order companies to do business elsewhere.
Well, okay, so what, he didn't order them to do the business, but he ordered them to start looking at alternatives.
Right, exactly. He ordered them to do so. And now, back when Truman basically took over heavy industries, some 60, 70 years ago, it used to get opposition from the Republicans. Today, you hear a lot of Trump supporters cash in their free market principles, cash in any semblance of respect for capitalism in their willingness to defend Trump no matter what, even if it seems like Trump thinks he's an economic dictator. Very disturbing. Very very discouraging.
It definitely is. And so when I was, it's funny because, Elizabeth Warren did this tweet about the economic patriotism. And so, of course, there is a substantive objection to something like this, right? She talks about these are supposedly American businesses, but they're not doing business in America and they need to be right. And so I write back and I'm trying to answer her. She's not going to read my thing, but I write back and I say, well, what about the American shareholders?
Right.
Right. And, she emphasizes the fact that, 1/3 of the shareholders are foreign, I guess, of these companies. Okay, but what about the 2/3 that are American, right?
They're publicly traded corporations that lots of Americans either own directly or indirectly through their retirement programs,
Yes.
funds and so forth.
And so basically I'm out there saying, well, what about this? And they say, oh, well, basically the shareholders have been doing so well, relatively speaking, again, comparatively speaking, right? Because they've had lower taxes on capital gains and this and the, right? So somehow it's like, oh, well, it's their turn to be fed off of, is essentially what Twitter is telling me back.
Right.
This idea that you can kind of redistribute the seed corn, as some people call it, so that others can consume now in the short run. And then what's going to happen in the long run? They're just, everybody can just look at, well, who's suffering the least bad now? And so Trump's going to brag about it. And then other people are going to say whoever's suffering the least bad is the one that has to now carry more burden for everybody else. It's this feeding frenzy. It's
if we were serious about the theft of intellectual property, we wouldn't mess around with tariffs, would we? We would respond with cyber attacks against China themselves whenever they did so. How about responding directly with responsive cyber attacks on their intellectual infrastructure, their communication infrastructure? I bet we're in a position to do greater harm to them than they are to us. And if we're not, we should get in such a position so that we don't have to rely on stupid tools like tariffs to get their attention when they're stealing intellectual property. The same thing applies to Hong Kong. If they are threatening an invasion of Hong Kong, we have many other tools, it seems to me, policy-wise, to influence China. We don't have to have diplomatic relations with them, frankly. These cultural exchanges, allowing Chinese university students to come in and learn our best science and technology. That's suicidal madness.
Right.
We have a beef with China on things like intellectual property theft or Hong Kong. It seems to me there's far more effective ways of getting at that. What are we doing with the World Trade Organization if they're helping, China violate agreements over and over? The entire thing's a sham. So it seems to me we have far more effective ways, if we're serious about China's bad behavior, of dealing with them than tariffs.
No, I mean, first of all, I've heard that in any of the deals that he's been trying to make with China, that they haven't actually addressed the intellectual property problem. So all of you people who think that in this dealing that he's doing, if he's the great negotiator, that the deal he's going to get is going to involve some solution to this problem, as far as I have heard, it isn't. If you have a link, go to my blog, don'tletitgo.com, put it in the comments, and you show me where there's evidence that any of the drafts of the trade deal that he has so far actually addresses the problem of intellectual property. Because otherwise, all I can tell that he's doing is he's saying, oh yeah, some people got some of their intellectual property stolen, and that's one of our many grievances against China that I'm not really concerned about in a principled way, but I'm just going to use as leverage to try to, imbalance this whole, sort of, what does he call it? Trade imbalance, the deficit or something, as if that's
so behind that any deal would have to be way pro us and anti them if he's going to sign it. And intellectual property is just one in a long laundry list. I think what he really doesn't like are cheap priced Chinese goods, because those compete with American producers.
Right.
And so it's not so much, intellectual property is just one thing on the list, right? And equally high on the list, as far as he's concerned, are, cheap products being provided to American consumers who are saving.
And the monetary manipulation, right? So,
jawbone the Fed.
So point being is that none of this is a concern to him because of, coming from a standpoint of principle. Otherwise, he would be addressing the problem in a very different way. He has this one size fits all tool that he uses, and it's tariffs. And so all it does is it still allows any of the goods that pose the problem to come in. So if, the concern is we don't want to buy goods from China because they are not only treating dissidents horribly, I've got a story in the notes about that, but they are clamping down on Hong Kong in a horrible, ominous way. If your concern is that, this is not addressing it at all. You're still allowing the goods in that are providing any of the money to support the bad things that China is doing, et cetera. All Trump is doing is skimming off the top. And then he's got this slush fund, right? He keeps bragging about it on Twitter, the billions and the billion. Where are the billions going? We know some of the billions are going to the farmers. I don't know much else.
Well,
and why are they going to the farmers? Because the farmers have said they're going to vote for him.
Right, but he's just so pleased as punch that we're raking in all this tariff revenue. Things couldn't be better as far as Trump is concerned with these tariffs. They're a wonderful tool, effective tool. I mean, even for immigration issues with Mexico. It doesn't even have to be a trade or economic issue. No. Trump will use this blunt instrument in any policy disagreement he has with our neighbors. So
yeah. And that money, it's coming out of the pockets of Americans. And maybe it's not coming directly out of the pockets. People do all this whole, oh, well, the company absorbs it, or no, eventually it's coming out of the pockets of some Americans, either through the way international banking works, and your own's described that, or it could be just because the company's going to reflect it in higher prices, or they're not going to pay their American employees as much. It's eventually coming out of our pockets. Everybody knows that in terms of the ability to create further wealth and productive activity, the money is going to do a lot more good in the pockets of whom? Trump in his slush fund, or in the pockets of Americans?
Consumers and investors. See, the thing is about cheap products is that let's say it hurts domestic industry. Let's say foreigners produce cheaper steel. Let's say they produce it as a result of government subsidies. Let's say that the cheaper foreign steel comes from government subsidies. All the better for the American consumers. It's true that the American steel industry might hurt, but the money saved by each and every consumer, and there's a whole lot more consumers of the product than there are producers of the product, means more money in their pocket to buy other stuff and to invest in other stuff. Mm-hmm. Our GDP, the way we calculate it today, counts destruction of capital equally with production and net production. So in other words, you're on a desert island. This is I steal this from a great economist. You're on a desert island, you catch 10 fish in a day, you eat one fish. GDP counts all 10 fish, even though your net is 9 fish. Mm. So in the next 9 days, you only consume one fish and catch no fish. The GDP is still plus one fish because you're consuming those fish.
Oh, so wow.
The destruction of fish is counted just as much as the net production of fish in our GDP. So GDP is a deceptive number. You can go well into eating seed corn and it could reflect in GDP numbers as positive growth when really all you're doing is eating existing capital, eating away at existing savings. And let's face it, all growth, all productivity growth, and ultimately all increases in net wealth come from savings, production, capital investment in production. So it's madness because every dime you're taking away from Americans is also a certain percentage of that is a dime taken away of further productivity in the future.
Yes. And if we were discussing Barack Obama right now, which, by the way, people who didn't follow me when Obama was president, I used to criticize him all the time in all the same ways that we're doing now. What I used to do with Obama, though, is I would sometimes just analyze a whole speech and point out all the fallacies and stuff. But I don't find Trump's, I analyze his tweets, right? I'll come back and I'll nitpick his tweets, but he's not giving speeches that, invite that the way Obama used to. Anyway, point is, if we were talking about Obama, everybody would keep their heads about them. and they would be making all of these criticisms, but somehow Trump gets a pass.
Oh,
And
yeah. No, when
that's the thing
Obama
I find
issued
scary
his
about him.
executive orders that looked like they may have exceeded a presidential authority, every Republican was out there screaming bloody murder. How dare Trump say his pen and his phone can do anything, even without an act of Congress? Recall that? That was just a few short years ago. And now those same voices that were critical of Obama are now defending, many of them at least, are defending Trump and willing to go to the mat for it. I was having a discussion on Facebook just the other day with someone, and I brought this point up. I said, if this was Obama issuing this tweet, you'd be screaming bloody murder. He's a socialist. He's a, communist or something. And the same guy said, yeah, I probably would be saying that about Obama, but I won't say that about Trump. How do we know what's really in his head? And to which my response is, well, it's only his tweets and what he tells us that gives us some idea of what's going on in his head.
Yeah. And so, the thing I don't understand, right? So he is waffling back and forth on China all through this weekend at the G7. And then he's going to explain it away and say, oh, this is just how I negotiate. Haven't you just given away your hand on negotiating at that point? If that's what you're saying, that
part of the deal. 4D chess, Amy. He's telling them that he schmoozes them and he waffles because this is how he negotiates. Well, that's not very helpful. What little I know about, business negotiations, I've learned through my wife and through certain books and through certain.
Okay.
And the first thing you learn is shut up. Don't make the first offer. Don't let them know your hand. Don't let them know your tactics. Spend the whole meeting maybe just quietly socializing, first meeting quietly socializing with them to figure out what their values are so you can be a better negotiator in the process. Trump isn't doing that, but we're told he is the expert at the art of the deal.
I guess we're going to find out. But as it stands, if you're, kind of tracking the headlines, it's not looking good economically. China is turning up the heat now on Trump, seeing that he's vulnerable.
Well, the economy was fragile all along, as Trump has been touting this greatest economy in American history, which it certainly is not. It's actually been very, very fragile. Just in the recent report, manufacturing is down, expenditure is way down, and now we have an inverted yield curve. And now the stock market is showing extreme volatility because of Trump's waffling on trade issues. Well, first of all, the big tariffs, that's enough to put the fear of God into every investor. But his waffling itself causes volatility. So, you use the word principle. The word principle and Trump do not go together in the same sentence. The man is a pragmatist who'll do whatever he thinks will help the perception of the economy, but the economy is fragile. And there are now a growing number of economists who see a recession around the corner.
Yeah. And the other example that we talked about was last time it was that he was going to put off certain of the tariffs with China until the stores had the chance to stock up for Christmas.
It was
he knows that they're damaged. So I think when China sees all this, they know that he isn't really serious or principled about anything and that they can just continue to put up the pressure. So obviously I'm concerned for us and our economy. I'm also concerned about Hong Kong, because if you've been following all of my social media feeds, I've been trying to provide support and just a little nudge of guidance to the protesters in Hong Kong, because for me, I'm so sympathetic to them trying to resist a takeover from a totalitarian regime like China. And it would be so great if they were just a slight bit more principled about what they're asking for. They're asking for democracy, and really they want respect for their rights, I think, and they think democracy is the vehicle for that. It's kind of a side issue now, given how sad and hopeless things look. But I think if they're counting on support from Trump, I just don't see that they're going to get it. I mean, they might get it incidentally as, luck. Like we got Gorsuch, for example, from Trump. There might be something good that comes out of his pragmatic.
But he's got a lot on his table with China right now, doesn't he? Aggression in the South China Sea, North Korea, the whole laundry list of trade issues, of which intellectual property is just one, and Hong Kong just appears to be one on the list. I can easily imagine a nightmare scenario with Trump in Shanghai signing a trade agreement with China that nominally decries the situation in Hong Kong, that says we in America really stand in solidarity with them, but which basically lets China take over. They're a bargaining chip. That's how I feel right now.
Yeah, you know, all I've seen in terms of official statements from him and from Pence are things that are asking for a humane or humanitarian solution or peaceful resolution. And
that's betrayal right there. When it becomes what it's becoming in China. I mean, a shot was fired, actually. No one was hit with the bullet, apparently, but a shot was fired, and they're using, all kinds of other forceful means, and it appears to be escalating. And when you have that, and someone uses a phrase like that, it kind of tells you that they're not really serious.
No. And I mean, I know that as of now, Carrie Lam is not budging at all in Hong Kong. The latest thing is she's saying, well, we're going to have all kinds of dialogue. I'm responding. You accuse me of not responding. I'm responding. It's just I'm not giving into your demands.
Right. I'll respond with a lot of words and a lot of things that may placate the international community, but your demands are not on the radar screen.
Yeah. And this is the sort of thing that you will get with every sort of, invalid government. There will be a process. Maybe your voice will be heard. You'll have a chance to vote. But in terms of substance, you're not going to have your rights protected, respected, honored. No. Right. And that's the message that we're getting from her. And, if you're calling for democracy and you think that having a mere vote is going to help by itself, no. What is voting right now? Like I said, I go out there on Twitter the other day with the, Elizabeth Warren and the economic patriotism and the blah, blah, blah. People, they just want to vote for who it is who has to be skinned now, and that's not going to help. A process in and of itself is not going to help. You have to have a system based on principle, guided, where the actions are guided around those principles. Trump is out there, oh, well, he's going to, try to do what's best to make America great. Well, great according to what? What does a great America look like for Trump? I've asked in the past. Right. It's not one based on these principles. And right. So, we've got Trump here abandoning principle. We have Carrie Lam saying, oh, I'm going to hear you. I'm going to provide a forum for dialogue. But in terms of any substance on the issue of rights, is she going to permanently withdraw that extradition bill? So I was going to say the magic 8 ball. What do they say? Sources say no, or something like that. I don't see any budging at this point.
Success for Trump, greatness for Trump. I think we're getting a clearer and clearer idea of it. It means territorial acquisition, maybe in Greenland. Mm-hmm. It means having deals with authoritarians which slightly favor the United States. Hurrah! It means keeping peaceful foreigners out who just want a job here, and protecting Americans from cradle to grave in any way we can, including healthcare. So what is greatness to him? It doesn't sound like greatness the way previous American presidents, especially previous Republican American presidents, have described, liberty and the free market, or even George W. Bush. Now, I was never a fan of either Bush, but even George W. Bush's 1,000 Points of Light gave better lip service to individual freedom and the free market than Trump ever gives. So what great America looks like to Trump is not at all clear to me. A strong president, an authoritarian president, perhaps, is a big part of that. One we can be proud of, one who makes foreign leaders look weak, as if that was what makes America great. What made America great, of course, is not democracy, but a respect for certain rights that were placed above any ability of the Democratic majority to interfere with. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, even property rights to a certain extent in our Bill of Rights were originally given greater respect than the power of Congress to make laws. And that's, in my view, what makes America great.
Yes, yes. And I've got that little kind of piece that I put out there. I had a spur of the moment inspiration. I just banged out a thread on Twitter and then turned it into a tiny essay. But, they say they want democracy, and everywhere when you read the articles, it's the pro-democracy movement, democracy for Hong Kong. Democracy is a process, and that process, if you take it literally, just means what? Go back to the ancient Greek model. What is pure democracy? Majority rule. Majority votes for Socrates to drink the hemlock, and Socrates has to drink the hemlock.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's really what it is. Now, if the mob, the majority, votes for freedom this week, then you get freedom, right?
Yes.
But most of the time, as I say there, the mob does not vote for freedom. The mob will vote to either persecute some minority or steal from some minority, as what's going on in the United States now. To the extent that we've become more democratic, we have voted to take more and more from the 1%. And people have this mindset that they can just vote to take more money from the 1%, and it's their turn to, hand over some more money. Now it's shareholders. We're going to take more money from them. That's what the mob does. The mob votes for that. So what is it that you really want? You want a system that's going to protect rights. And Hong Kong has had that to a certain extent. There's been rule of law. This is what has made Hong Kong so high on the Freedom Index, kicking United States butt every year for I don't know how long now, right? You read it, Hong Kong's one of top 3 or something.
Right.
And China, they're supposed to be waiting till 2047 to get their grubby paws on Hong Kong. And they just have decided, I guess they can't wait. They want to clamp down on dissidents like they're doing in China now. And so here comes this extradition bill. It's, chipping away at the protections that they've had. But ideally, what do you want? I don't know exactly the structure of what Hong Kong has. I know it's probably descended from the British system, which has some substantive, explicit protection for rights, has a system that has some checks and balances, some rule of law, but it is probably not as good as even what they have in Britain now. And so what we have in the United States is probably the best model for what anybody who wants their rights respected could aspire to. What do we have? We have a constitution that explicitly limits the actions of government in accordance with a basic principle that even the founders understood to a very, very large extent, which is that principle of individual rights. That's what government is supposed to be doing. It's supposed to be acting only in the protection of individual rights. It's supposed to be constrained, and that's what our Constitution was designed to do, to limit the actions of government. Our Constitution, via the Bill of Rights, also contains explicit protection for some rights. And it's supposed to be the case that, go ahead, I'm sorry.
Make no law.
Yeah.
Those are my 3 favorite words in the whole of the continent. It's got some good ones. No state shall deprive any person of equal protection of the laws is a pretty good one.
Yes.
There are a lot of good ones in there, but absolutely my 3
no warrants shall issue, right?
Oh, that's a good one too. Yeah. But the biggest sort of meta protection for all of our rights is the Bill of Rights, beginning with those wonderful words, Congress shall make no law. This is outside the majority's capacity to regulate, period.
Yes.
And any system that aspires to be a just, fair system must recognize that majority rule is just a form of fascism at the end of the day. If they can truly control everything just by, it doesn't really matter whether it's a strong man like Stalin or Hitler, or whether it really is a majority vote. If your rights are, if we've got a room full of 10 people, and let's say we have 9 people who decide to beat up the 10th person, does that super 90% majority somehow confer legitimacy on the idea of beating up that 10th guy? No.
But I mean, hey, the 10th guy got a vote, right? He was able.
That's what we're told. Right. Because the 10th guy got a vote, it's fair that the other 9 get to beat him up.
Let's have a dialogue, you know.
Yeah, that's what dialogue.
I'll set up a forum for a dialogue.
He got to express his objection to being beaten up 5 minutes later. Yeah.
So this is the context from which I read all of this stuff that's coming from Carrie Lam. You know, there's one video, and I should have added it in the program notes again, where she's asked explicitly from this awesome BBC reporter, and he says, do you or do you not have the power yourself to withdraw this bill? And she won't answer it. And it's because the answer is no, right?
Right.
And that's what it comes to at the end of the day, which I hate that phrase, but really this what happens here is that she is only gonna listen and she's not gonna budge as far as we can tell. Anyway, so you know, continuing on what we want in terms of a system, we want that constitution to limit government primarily. It is a limitation on the grant of power to government, telling government what its only proper legitimate purpose is, which is to defend rights, not to go out there and regulate in advance. And, you know, the US code is some monstrosity now. You studied it in law school. I studied it in law school. Just look at it in the library. It's a horrific.
Terrifying.
Yeah. Volumes and volumes and volumes.
Go to federal regulations.
Yeah, no, it's crazy. So, you know, that's not legitimate. Really, I think if the founders were consistent, that wouldn't be here. But, you know, it's supposed to just be an explicit grant of power, limiting government to certain actions and no others. You can have, as we do have in our Bill of Rights, an explicit list of certain guarantees of basic rights, but it shouldn't be necessary, I think, as some framers argued. Right. And certainly, we should be respecting what it actually says in the Bill of Rights. Is that the 9th Amendment that says that the grant of certain guarantees should not mean that there are not other rights that are explicitly reserved to the people?
This Constitution should not be construed to deny or disparage others that the people have. And the 10th Amendment says that if the power has not been granted to the federal government by this Constitution, it's reserved for the states or the people themselves. Those two amendments, you know, there's a great debate between how to read the Constitution broadly, like the left wants to read it, or narrowly, like the right wants to read it. Well, the framers disagreed with both. Mm-hmm. And they gave us the key code in the 9th and 10th Amendments, didn't they?
Yes.
Read powers very narrowly. And if it's a process or a power, it should be read with great specificity and narrowness. If, however, it is an acknowledgement of freedoms and rights that individuals retain, it should be read in the broadest fashion possible. So you've got, on the right, you've got these sticklers about procedure and powers, but then they say it's also wrong for the Supreme Court to recognize the broad scope of the liberties, even though the framers put it in very broad, abstract language: freedom of speech, freedom of religion. No. Don't be deceived by that broad language or the 9th Amendment. We have to read that stuff narrowly as well. Whereas the left says, well, it's all a living, breathing Constitution. We can read it any of it any way we want. The 9th and 10th Amendments can sort of be ignored. So both sides of the debate are basically wrong when it comes to constitutional interpretation.
Yes. And I want to put emphasis on one word that you used and you're very careful. And I try to be very careful. Even in my tweet storm the other day, I was very careful about certain words that I used. You used the word acknowledgement in the Bill of Rights.
Right.
This is not a grant of rights. Government does not grant rights. You have rights, certain rights as a human being, which the framers were right in saying that those rights are inalienable. There are yours by virtue of the fact that you are a human being. You have certain needs in order to survive. It is proper for you as a living thing to work to sustain yourself as the type of thing that you are. And in order to do that, certain rights are necessary. And our founders understood that, and they understood its implications to a very large extent. They weren't 100% consistent.
Oh,
we had slavery, in our Constitution.
notice, though, that even the debate over slavery, all of this, the debate over the Bill of Rights when the Constitution first came in, and then later on the debate over slavery and the aftermath of the Civil War is very revealing. There are a lot of legal scholars who say that the Declaration of Independence and its philosophical assertions about natural rights are not really part of the American legal system. Mm. That ignores basic American history. There would be no Bill of Rights but for the philosophy expressed in the Declaration. The author, the principal author of the Declaration, Thomas Jefferson, was the one who insisted on including a Bill of Rights in the Constitution, or he wouldn't have supported the Constitution and gone on to be part of George Washington's first cabinet. And the response to him by the Federalists in favor of the Constitution as it was simply that when we list certain powers in Article 1 of the body of the Constitution that Congress has, that's the whole list. If that's not on the list, then the Congress can't do it. So it would be dangerous to include a Bill of Rights because you'd think that the grant of rights was somehow an enumerated list that we have to stick to. That's why they included the 9th and 10th Amendments. Yes. Don't take this as an exclusive list of rights. And then when Lincoln faced the Civil War, 77 years later, he actually used the principles of the Declaration of Independence in, for example, famously, the Gettysburg Address. Mm-hmm. And he used it to convert the Civil War into a crusade against slavery. And precisely because Lincoln invoked the philosophy of the Declaration, we got the 13th and 14th Amendments, no slavery, equal protection under the laws in the 14th Amendment. Those are the direct upshot of the philosophy found in the Declaration of Independence. And that is the touchstone. Those natural rights must be the touchstone. And the minute we got away from that, and certainly 20th and 21st century Supreme Court jurisprudence basically ignores natural rights as a concept. We started going way downhill.
Now, we should have a show maybe on that whole issue of natural rights, because the objectivist or, Rand's position on this is not quite a natural rights theory. Right. Natural rights is more of what we would call an intrinsicist theory. Right. But we could get into the technicalities a bit later. Certainly a natural rights view has a lot more to say for it than what we would call a positivist view. A positivist view would say that simply by, going through certain processes and procedures, the thing that we call rights come about, but it's just really what human beings say they are. It's not anything that...
Rights can be whatever the law or the people say they are at the time. They're sort of a normative convenience, like all normative things. Yeah. I would say that, yes, we can technically disagree with either the terminology natural rights or the philosophical foundation that were given them. But the fact that these rights stand sort of outside the Constitution and should inform the Constitution, not the other way around, I think was the good part of that.
Yes.
In other words, they appreciated what you said earlier. It's the rights that are out there that we have, and the government is simply acknowledging the existing rights as a moral concept that everyone possesses.
Yes. That's one show that I think would be very fun to do and talk about. And I don't know if we would combine another topic with it, but there's another huge topic which I've been bumping up against recently out on Twitter and such, and that's the whole anarchy debate. So, what is the argument for anarchy? Can you really ever have a government that is going to respect rights, that you could count on to respect rights? When I'm in my little piece for Hong Kong, I'm arguing for a limited government that, again, has the Constitution we've talked about, with the explicit limitations plus explicit guarantees of certain rights. And then in addition, instills a system of checks and balances. Why are checks and balances necessary? Because even if you have a constitution with all of the appropriate language recognizing that government is formed on the principle of individual rights with the explicit guarantees, explicit limitations, you nonetheless need a system of checks and balances, different branches of government to serve as a check on others, because there is human error. And there is sometimes human corruption still. We have free will as human beings. We can decide to make mistakes, unfortunately, and we can also decide to be evil, as Google would put it. And as it stands right now, because in part, I think because of a lack of an explicitly consistent philosophy, there have been certain errors made. And I think the errors that have been made in our system have in fact invited that sort of corruption.
Exactly.
Why do we have a swamp? We have a swamp, I think, because errors resulted in certain government controls. And to the extent there are government controls, Bastiat told us that you could imagine that there's going to be a swamp coming up. I mean, that's what basically Bastiat says, freedom or the swamp. And those are your choices, right?
Really. The whole point, as James Madison, often called the father of the Constitution, the whole way he defended separation of powers in the Federalist and the original constitutional system was just that. It's a protection against the concentration of power in any one branch of government. That's why we have an independent judiciary. That's why we have a powerful Congress. That's why we have the president with limited powers, though. That's why we have a president who can veto that, and so forth. And when you see in the 20th century, in the middle of the 20th century, we faced a sort of a constitutional crisis as all these regulatory agencies, these federal agencies, came into being. The Securities and Exchange Commission and so forth in the 30s, and by the 70s, the Environmental Protection Agency. So there was an issue there because these agencies basically seemed to violate the separation of powers. They both make the rule that has to be obeyed. They investigate and enforce the rule and prosecute a violation of the rule, and they're the ultimate judicial resolution. They decide the matter themselves. So they combine all three features, executive, legislative, and judicial, in one agency.
Yes.
And the Supreme Court had to cut a Grand Canyon of exceptions starting in the 1950s straight through American jurisprudence to say, oh, no, that's okay, so long as Congress gives its power in such and such a way, and so long as there's like you put it, a process by which people can be heard and so forth, then it's all hunky-dory and who cares? We can have violations of separation of powers so long as they're in these all-powerful agencies rather than in the president or the Congress proper.
Yeah, I mean, all they have to do is put out some sort of request for comment and things like that. And then, hey, your voice has been heard. They can do whatever they want after they show that they've heard you.
Right. And balanced, you see, the interest. That's ridiculous. Balanced weighed the competing interests and found which is the more important interest under existing law. And if they've done that, well, then they can basically do. The EPA can say a pond in your backyard comes under, the Water Preservation of Waters Act. It's frightening.
Yes. So now in our system, it's eroded, and that's one thing that I talked about. Of course, one thing that detracted some people from liking my statement about Hong Kong is that I mentioned explicitly that our system of checks and balances has eroded to the point where Trump, our president, thinks that he can order businesses around in his tweets. I hereby order.
Right.
Again, if Obama was out there doing it, people would just be up in arms. They would still keep in their mind the necessity of preserving a system of checks and balances. There were liberal legal scholars who, under Obama, would sound the alarm bells and say, look what Obama is doing in terms of aggregating to himself more power for the executive.
Obama himself campaigned against George H.W. Bush's executive orders. During his first presidential campaign, he complained loudly about how W, his predecessor, was using executive authority way outside his scope.
Yeah.
And before he's all done, he's talking about how omnipotent his phone and his pen are.
Yeah. So the question that the anarchist is going to pose to me, given that our history has been what it is, and we've seen that United States government is out of control now, such that we're so low on the freedom index, lower than Hong Kong, who's very at stake, right? If it's happened here, then is it true that what the anarchists say, and this is, I think, for a future show, let's dive into this. Yeah. Am I right to have a belief in the possibility for a limited government? Would it be right to even aspire to perfect limited government, or you have to give up on the whole project? That's another question, right? What does a perfect limited government even look like? And
Yeah,
what do we expect from it? That sort of thing.
the anarchist has a historical point. I don't think it's a sufficient one, but look at the history of governments.
Yeah.
It is true that pharaohs and kings and dictators have made individual criminals look like amateur pikers compared to the violence and theft, expropriation, and enslavement departments. What governments have done have eclipsed the total of what individual criminals have done in history. That's why our framers gave us a Bill of Rights and a constitution that allegedly limited government. And America's own experience has shown that government power can still get out of hand, even when you start out with a constitution and intentions that good.
Yes.
On the other hand, I back up as a historian. My historian instincts kick in, and I back up and I see the huge progress that humanity has actually made. For most of our history, slavery was considered by the educated and by the moral and good people as a good thing, as an inevitable thing, a natural thing. Aristotle himself argued for natural slavery, right? And his arguments were used for millennia after that. Indeed, even as late as the antebellum South, when they were defending slavery in the South. Biblical arguments for slavery were used in the antebellum South.
Yes.
But look today, the educated, civilized mind now agrees that slavery is wrong. And although it still exists, it is morally condemned, and it's freedom that's thought of as natural and the proper state. Look at the fact that America ever happened at all, that the original intentions of our framers ever came into being at all. That was the product of thousands of years of moral education and development in the West, even to come about. So in the big picture, do I think progress is possible? Do I think a moral government is achievable? Yes. Humans are capable of making a system that defends the rights that need to be protected for all individuals. And it's a question really of our ideas. It's the ideas that created the good parts of America in the first place, and it's the bad ideas of late that have so badly corrupted it.
Yeah. So I guess with the way we'll put it, we've got to do this in a future show, I think. Is government a necessary good, which is the phrase that a number of objectivists have been using lately to describe it. Is it a necessary good? And we want to get all of those.
I was a student of the late anarchist economist Murray N. Rothbard. It was called Mr. Libertarian in his time. And I became friendly with him. I had studied with him when I lived in New York City, and I'm very familiar with
all the arguments. Oh, good.
This last week on Facebook, I had an argument with an anarchist over Trump's tweet ordering companies to start leaving China. The anarchists took the position. It was funny. There was a conservative who took the position. Oh, no big deal. It's just words. Give Trump a chance. And an anarchist on the other side said, no, this is inherent. This is inevitable with government.
Right. Right. And then, of course, none of the above. We're going to probably carve out something that's neither of those, right?
Make everyone angry.
That's a spoiler alert, and you're going to guess. Of course, we're going to do that, but how and exactly that's what we'll leave for another show. I want to wrap up the Hong Kong topic a minute, but let's just get a couple things out there, and then I'm going to ask you a question. Pop quiz. Are you ready? Okay, so one, of course, is the story about the espionage charges against Yang Hengjun. Is that how you would pronounce his name? They're saying that, espionage, he's guilty of espionage. It just so happens that for the last 10 years, he has been an outspoken critic of the Chinese regime and an advocate for increased freedom in China. And, he finds himself imprisoned and detained for months and months and months with no ability to have an attorney or have charges pressed against him. And then finally, months later, they move him to a place where he's able to at least see somebody for a half an hour once a month or whatever, a representative from
something for an hour once a month. His wife is also being kept in China, and he is a foreign national. He's lived in the United States and he's a citizen of Australia.
Mm-hmm.
He's a writer, a diplomat. What the heck is going on? There should be a giant hue and cry against that, but that's China. Mainland China will arrest people, even foreigners, if they don't like what they're saying. I do not for 1 minute believe that this guy was involved in espionage for Australia.
No, I don't think so either. And of course, depending on the type of espionage they charge him with, there's potentially a capital penalty. Yeah, I
Yeah,
read that in an article. It depends on what form.
right.
So that remains to be seen. But the message is that with the extradition bill, this is Hong Kong's future potentially. We've got another article about the Chinese Communist Party is working behind the scenes to counter the protests in Hong Kong. It's
Right.
not looking good. So the question would be, what could, I mean, I'm doing all that I can at this point, which is just out there speaking, but there's no good for me to go to Hong Kong myself, I don't think. Um,
I'd be concerned now going to Hong Kong.
that United canceled flights from Chicago to Hong Kong was one of the things because there's just not the demand. Gee, I wonder why people are not wanting to go there because they're seeing it not as safe. What should Trump do, if anything? It's not necessarily that we should get involved militarily there.
Well,
What should he do? Try to end on.
China treats foreign nationals, we should treat their foreign nationals in a similar fashion. Not arrest them, kick them out. Kick them out. If you're a diplomatic personnel, people here on student visas, people here on some kind of special favor that they got from both the Chinese and the U.S. government, we can start taking it out on their people too. I would expel diplomats if they treated foreigners like that.
Yeah, and so basically, you're saying a cutting off of diplomatic relations, then.
Well, steps in that direction, I think, are certainly warranted if they're detaining foreign nationals on this basis.
Yeah. So you could point to that, of course, as a reason for doing it. And then also for what they're doing in Hong Kong as a reason for doing this as well.
Yeah.
What would you do with respect to trade and making any sort of a trade deal? And would you order an embargo? And would you actually order American businesses to leave doing it the right way, not with some tweet out on Twitter? What would you do?
There is a point, I think, where the government can do a trade embargo.
Yeah.
I think that tariffs are probably what you're saying is certain products coming out of the whole idea of tariffs are suspicious to me. Even when you have a national security issue like Hong Kong, I just don't see tariffs as a very effective tool. Maybe, but there would come a point, I think, where an economic embargo would make sense. Absolutely. No question about that in my mind. Now, where we draw the line with what we do, that's a tough question, but we're doing the wrong thing. I don't think China would keep any trade deal. Even let's say we had a trade deal with them. I mean, look how many violations of the WTO we've got rulings against China on. Does China care? Will China do anything? They've violated World Trade Organization rules left and right. We've complained.
Right.
We've got adjudications against them, and nothing is done. So yeah, a trade embargo at some point makes a whole lot more sense to me than, say, tariffs on selected goods.
So maybe an embargo, but then, if you look at Hong Kong, for me, the value right now is a lot of symbolic value, because I see it as one of the freest places in the world. The analogy that keeps coming to my mind, so I'll spit it out, whatever, got something in my brain, I'm going to just let it go. The trade towers in New York City as this symbol of capitalism and the virtue of capitalism, productivity, and these hideous terrorists, flying planes into them in the name of religion, which we'll talk about in a minute. So nihilistic, so destructive. What a horrible act in terms of symbolism. And you'd say, okay, well, it's, just two towers in the middle of one city and the whatever. But symbolically, right? It's a horrible, horrible thing to have occurred. And so I see these thugs in China who are just gonna, strong arm in there and take over Hong Kong. And Hong Kong was sold out. We sold them out. Britain sold them out. They were going to be taken over in 2047 in some thuggish way anyway. I mean, here we are just sending them off to the gallows.
No, a president of the United States should have been on it and should have been demanding of China long ago. Hong Kong's freedom should last longer than 50 years, and that's one of our conditions. I mean, that should have been on the table already for us. That 2047 date is artificial. Why should they be enslaved then? Just because the British agreed. The people of Hong Kong have rights, inalienable individual rights, just like Americans, and that should be our approach, our moral approach.
I mean, so, morally speaking, anybody who wanted to go in and aid this would be completely morally justified, because you have this thuggish totalitarian dictatorship.
We'd have a right to take military action, in my view.
Sure. But do we have an adequate...
no problem with sending a carrier group to the South China Sea right now, just to make that point.
Right. But do we have an adequate interest in doing so is the question. There's some American interest obviously represented in Hong Kong in terms of business investments and things like that. But what?
I'm not happy, hopeful, optimistic, or sanguine about what's going to happen, precisely because Trump's in charge. Our best bet for the freedom of China, my holdout hope, or Hong Kong, my holdout hope for Hong Kong is the international perception that China would suffer as a result. Now, they don't much care about international opinion, but if they were to just invade and take over and crack down and, and shackle the people of Hong Kong in the next year or so, I think there would be an international hue and cry. The Europeans would probably pay a lot of lip service to it. There might be international organizations who pressure people to do things, but it's that kind of international pressure that is the only thing that is going to stop China from doing that.
So we need international pressure. Do we see other leaders coming forth with the pressure? We have Britain to a certain extent trying.
Saying things, yeah. America is the leader here. And without American leadership here, I do not think we can expect real action from any of even our allies who might give lip service to Hong Kong freedom. Britain.
So our basic hope is kind of what I've seen happen a little bit, but maybe it just needs to happen more, is that even Trump is seeing that his constituency, whatever that is, would also value freedom in Hong Kong. That all these things that he does to sort of throw red meat out there, as we put it, helping Hong Kong should be one of those.
Yeah. Well, those ladies in Hong Kong,
he sees that for his reelection.
Yeah, those ladies in Hong Kong want to go ban and boycott Israel. I wonder what they think of Hong Kong. I really do. Do they really care at all about the freedom of Hong Kong? Or what, we get rockets fired from occupied territories into Israel just within the last day or two. And these congresswomen seem to ignore the fact that these, quote, Palestinians have repeatedly rejected offers for a two-state solution and 90% of the occupied territories. No, they want the destruction of Israel. And they continue to fire rockets into Israel. And so long as that happens, so long as they and their allies continue to chant death to Israel and death to the United States, their sympathy, these Congress ladies, their sympathy is all with the quote Palestinians, and they somehow can't find it in their heart to worry about the fate of actual people who are actually civilized and free being taken over in an aggressive way by a terrible dictatorship.
Right. And maybe it is that, for us, we see Hong Kong as sort of similar to the trade towers in New York City, as symbols of wealth and prosperity. And those aren't viewed with the kind of reverence that we have by everybody.
Just look at that colorful Hong Kong skyline.
Which I've never seen in person. You have not been either?
Not either. No, but I've actually seen, cell phone videos that friends were taking from across the water at some spectacular light display that they have. And you can see the buildings and the lights and the people. Boy, they are a symbol, just like the World Trade Center. They really are. And their destruction would be something on that order.
Yeah. And that's what I'm seeing. It's like we can prevent another 9/11 that is impending.
See, in America, we could build a Freedom Tower on the ruins, near Battery Park, where the World Trade Center was knocked down. Should China take over Hong Kong and things start decaying there, don't expect a glorious rebuilding.
Well, okay, so there is one thing that we didn't talk about that Trump could do, and it would, go against all of his immigration policies. Allow refugee status for everybody who wants to leave and seek a better life here in the United States. Say, okay, you want to do that to your.
We don't need to loosen our asylum laws. We need to tighten them, according to Trump.
Yeah. So trade embargo is one thing that he could do that would be very principled in a situation like this.
Yes.
You taught the American interest. If you're going to talk about a true American interest in Hong Kong and taking action on the basis of it, it would have to be more than just numbers, I think, right? It would have to be Hong Kong as this symbol of freedom and prosperity and capitalism and individualism on which our country was founded. These are brothers of ours. And, I've had people in chats on your own's more, right? The white rule in China and in Hong Kong was so much better than what it's not an issue of white and whatever. It's an issue of ideology. It's,
oh my gosh, to look at it in terms of race is nightmarish. I mean, my gosh. We're ethnically the same. We speak the same language, so we have a right to enslave them. And what? This is more like East and West Germany during the Cold War. This is more like East and West Berlin during the Cold War. The same ethnicity, the same culture, the same language, the same people, almost in a clinical experiment, telling us what works, totalitarianism or freedom. And I think Hong Kong kind of is a demonstration, just like West Berlin and West Germany was sort of a demonstration of the obvious vast superiority of freedom just for the ordinary person over dictatorship and slavery.
Now, I've got someone over here in the chat at YouTube, calls himself objectivist, I guess. Immigration can destroy a country peacefully. First of all, not if you have a proper system of checks and balances that we're talking about. And I'm not going to go against the principles, which would we allow peaceful, more open immigration in order to, achieve some temporary protection for this moment, et cetera, right? It's all about let's see which carcasses we can feed off of for the time being. I think the immigration policy is another version of that. But so let's say we open immigration to anybody who wants to come in from Hong Kong and come here and be productive and seek a better life. People who love the CCP, as it's called in various interesting spell out acronyms
right.
by the Hong Kong the protesters out there. I'm sorry, I got distracted because some people were very funny of what does CCP stand for, and I was laughing at some of the protesters and what they're saying the CCP stands for. People who like the CCP, they can stay there. The people who want freedom, let them come to the United States. Trump, if he was truly a leader of a great America, would say, you guys are our brothers, Right. You guys are the people who are protesting and demanding that their rights be respected, demanding respect for the rule of law, et cetera. They are our brothers. Allow them to come here. And yeah, let's have an open immigration policy, because those people would counterbalance all of the Democrat voting immigrants that you're worried about, objectivist over here in the chat room. At
120 years ago, we were given many of the same arguments that America was being destroyed by all these immigrants coming in, from Eastern Europe and Southern Europe. The minute that Italians and Eastern Europeans and Jews invade through Ellis Island, at the turn of the 20th century and in the couple decades that followed that, there was vast immigration to this country. And of course, white Protestant Americans, going back even further, white Protestant Americans didn't like Irish immigration coming over because of the potato famine, thinking that Catholics would destroy our culture, our Protestant culture in America. And of course, that's why there's a public school system. And that's why we have a parochial Catholic school system side by side in the United States, precisely because of this criticism. The public school system was sort of developed to maintain and protect the Protestant values of natives against the cultural onslaught of immigrants, and how they would so radically change America. Now, at that time, it was not perceived that these people were going to become Democrats necessarily, but they would change American culture in some fundamental way. But of course, it never happened. They acculturated, they learned the language, they became as American and as any other Americans did. And we see the same process happening with nearly every immigrant group, including those from Latin America. Now, as Republicans take a harsh stance against immigration, they're sort of making themselves the enemy of Latin American immigrants, in my view.
Yes.
And the people who want to come here are precisely the ones self-selecting for being ambitious, for wanting a better life, for wanting something different.
Yes.
So yeah, loosen up the asylum laws. Let every peaceful Hong Konger in that possibly can. What a boon to America that would be, as immigrants have always been to America, culturally, economically, and in every other way.
Yes. So we would not have to get involved militarily in order to provide principled, moral, and even substantive support for Hong Kong, consistent with our limited model of government. There could be an embargo because we do see the takeover of Hong Kong as inimical to some actual concrete American interests. But there's also this symbolic, again, spiritual, that I think I'm having a hard time articulating it, but you see the analogy to 9/11 that I was trying to state there.
Very good.
But that's what kept coming to my mind, is that basically we're trying to prevent a 9/11. So he could do that, but the chances of him doing that, I think, are slim. And I'll just leave people with this, because I want to talk about this religion and politics topic of yours, James. Think of what Reagan would have done. Think of the sort of speeches that Reagan might have given in support of the protests in Hong Kong, and think of some of the things he might have done along the lines of an embargo that he would actually give fair warning to businesses about, because he would be actually sympathetic to business interests. In
Reagan didn't go calling Soviet leaders great friends and great fellows and wonderful people and dear friends of mine, and people whose regimes he wished to indefinitely secure, did he? He called the Soviet Empire an evil empire. He went to Berlin and said, tear down this wall. Wouldn't it be nice to have a president who'd cut a beeline for the island of Hong Kong right now?
Wow, yes.
Make a big speech and say this would be an act of horrible aggression.
Is there a Trump Tower in Hong Kong?
I'm sorry?
Is there a Trump Tower in Hong Kong? There is, like, everywhere else.
I'm not sure. I don't think
there
so.
should be.
I don't know. Does he have a resort there?
He should.
Of course.
I'd have to look it up. If somebody wants to look it up and let us know. But I mean, imagine if there were a Trump Tower in Hong Kong, which there should be, and if he would go there.
Right.
Imagine how powerful that could be. Right.
Oh, yeah. See, my first thought was the president should go to Hong Kong. Mm-hmm. I'm here. Free people come here. America's interests are here. China would be evil if it cracked down here. We would care. He could define the evil as evil. And as I say, even on other issues, tariffs just the wrong way to approach. And we don't need to mix the issues, Hong Kong and intellectual theft. If there's intellectual theft, we should be hitting them back in kind with cyber attacks of our own.
Or ban anything that was produced as a result of intellectual property theft. Yes.
Cultural exchanges, allowing Chinese nationals to get their education at American universities. We can cut all that off too.
Yes.
Nor should they be able to be interns at high-tech companies in this country. We could do all that short of, coming up with some deal that China would likely violate anyway.
Yes. Yes. So instead we have the pragmatist in chief doing his thing, and that's really what the Republicans are about. And what are we now given as an alternative to this pragmatism that is unprincipled, that's leading to further and further controls? We have the alternative being religion. That's the other major thread that I see as a danger. And you've given me a number of stories. There's 3 different stories that I've posted from James over at the blog, don'tletitgo.com. You can see in the program notes, 3 different stories talking about using religion citing the Bible, injecting faith into messages, not just by Republicans now, the Democrats are picking up this mantle. So what do you see, James, and what do you
Well,
predict?
in a general way, it's always been the case that the Democratic Party, just like Karl Marx himself, has basically advocated a secular form of the ethics of the New Testament, the ethics of Christianity. Christianity is about sacrifice, about holding property collectively, about how money is the root of all sorts of evils, how money is a corruption, how helping the poor is more important than accumulating wealth or being happy. Look at the birds of the air and the lilies of the field, right? So this de-emphasis on wealth, this distrust of money, this desire to sacrifice for everyone else, this communal property, all those ideals are stated as moral ideals in the New Testament, but have been the basic moral presuppositions of socialism from the outset. There were Christian socialists in the 19th century, and then, of course, there was Marx, who's a famous atheist communist in the 19th century, but they both shared the same values. And even before recent politics, it's plain that what informed the New Deal and progressives and LBJ was an assumption on the part of Americans of Christian values. Republicans are the ones, of course, who've taken the mantle of, usually taken the mantle of defending religion in the name of defending traditional values against abortion, forced school prayer, and so forth. So in civil liberties issues, it's the Republicans who very loudly proclaim their Christianity, wear their religion on their sleeve. In this instance, what we see recently is Democrats realizing that Americans are very, very Christian, whether left or right or independent. Christian values, if not a strict traditional adherence to some traditional denomination has fallen off, Christian values still very much govern the thinking and the feeling on both the left and the right. And the left has picked up on this. They realize that seeming anti-religion is not going to help them win in some of these swing states. So I think it's politically pragmatic on their part, but look at what they're saying, what all of them are saying all year long, whether it's Elizabeth Warren quoting Jesus and talking about how what we do to the least of us is the test and how that implies government policy on welfare, or Nancy Pelosi quoting the Bible, her Christianity informs her leftist politics. Mayor Pete is maybe the most prominent of all of these. He, for example, just recently defending the minimum wage, he says the Republicans are hypocrites. They can't call themselves true Christians. We Democrats own the ethics of Jesus and the New Testament because we're in favor of things like higher $15 minimum wage and helping poor more and Medicare for all. Cory Booker is another one. Senator Booker has been very explicit about how we need biblical principles and how these biblical principles need to inform our policy. This is somewhat disturbing to me because, 20 years ago, Democrats would be saying, hey, there needs to be a separation between our religious ethics and our public policy. So Democrats, for example, Catholic Democrats like the Kennedys, who were pro-choice on abortion, but still claimed to be good practicing Catholics, were often criticized by conservatives for this dichotomy. Hey, how can your religious ethics be in this box and your public policy be in this other box? Well, it looks like Democrats are changing their tune on that. They're saying, no, no, no. In fact, our policies are more consistent with Christian ethics than the Republicans are. And there's now a battle for that moral high ground, for who's going to control, what would Jesus do as a question? Is it the welfare statists? And it's not just domestic policy, it's foreign policy. This pacifism, this international attitude against even rational self-defense of Americans abroad really has its roots in Christian suppositions about turning the other cheek and how peace is always the answer and how there's always a peaceful solution.
Just war theory back to Augustine and stuff, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah. So right now, and let's face it, no argument by an economist, no argument from a legal scholar is going to be nearly so effective as that moral high ground is when it comes to actual public policy. Now, actual public policy is determined by the moral high ground, not by some technical argument from some economist or lawyer.
No, definitely. And are you going to vote your morality, vote your wallets? This is what Yaron's always talked about, that people are voting their morality, and maybe the Democrats are seeing this. Two things. One is this could be part of the reason that, I don't know if you could have predicted some of the good things that would have come from Ronald Reagan, some of those great speeches and everything else. I don't think Rand could ever have predicted that, but she wanted to not vote for him. She was very much against him because of this bringing religion back into politics. And I think she saw the writing on the wall. And we're seeing that now. We're seeing the Democrats pick it up. The Democrats are saying, I think quite rightly to the Republicans, now that religion has infused that party again, you're hypocrites.
Yeah.
You're hypocrites to the extent that you are resisting our, love your neighbor as yourself, and the duty to help your neighbor substantively, etc. They're seeing that the separation of economics and ethics is
I'm just waiting for the Democrat politician to quote Jesus saying, "When they take your coat, give them your shirt too."
oh, sure. No, I mean, it's going to happen. So there's that. And then Nell over here on YouTube is bringing up something else, and it's at a different level. So you've got the ethics, right, that they want to go ahead and co-opt and say, okay, to the extent that we can ride on the religion of the Republicans and make them feel bad for denying minimum wage and all these other goodies, freebies. Nell is kind of tapping into the idea that maybe the left is identifying the authoritarian strain that the Republicans are cashing in on right now, that Trump has cashed in on. I really did like so much Onkar's piece that he wrote, Onkar Gatte's piece that he wrote for the Ayn Rand Institute, talking about the danger of Trump in terms of the authoritarian aspect. And we see evidence all the time. I see evidence all the time. People just passionately defending things that Trump does when they would never have done it when Obama does. And this is just a sign, within our own ranks, so to speak, loosely conceived, of people having an authoritarian attitude towards Trump. He's a savior of some kind. He is, people say, why are you criticizing Trump when he's saved the world? Trump has somehow already saved the world. I don't see how that has occurred.
You've got an amazing dichotomy. You've got someone just the other day saying he killed more people than Stalin and Hitler. And on the other side, you've got Republicans saying he is the chosen one. Trump's words were well selected. He's a messiah saving us from what? Ayn Rand was a prophet here. Ayn Rand was an absolute prophet here in precisely this regard. Back in the 60s, actually, she had nice things to say about Ronald Reagan, but that's when he was governor of California and signing a liberal abortion bill. By the late 70s, Ayn Rand had recognized the danger of what Reagan was doing to the whole party in associating with them with the moral majority and on social issues like abortion. And here, decades after Ayn Rand's death, the Democrats are now imitating Ronald Reagan and jumping on that same bandwagon to justify their economic policies. Yes. So here we have a great example of Ayn Rand's prescience and her ability to see the danger that we were sliding into. And if religion is more important, if the New Testament is more important than the Constitution, then it's hardly surprising to see Republicans going down the authoritarian or even the socialist path like Trump is in imitation of the Democrats.
Right. But what this Nell in the chat room is saying is that the Democrats are seeing the value of using religion to help instill a more authoritarian type of perspective from some of the voters. So, I guess to the extent that the Democrats are trying to appeal to the independent voter who is some kind of Christian, say, imagine that they can use religion and say, oh, well, don't vote for the Republicans. They're just a bunch of hypocrites. If they were really consistent, then they would support things like minimum wage and more redistribution of wealth.
Republicans, I bet, who would join them to some extent with that very point. As a good Christian, I favor a more realistic minimum wage. As a good Christian, I favor, just a social safety net as opposed to maybe Medicare for all. So Republicans are perfectly willing to accept that argument when it comes to compromising on capitalism.
Yes.
They have been willing to make that compromise, I think, because of their religious ethics for decades. But let me ask a rhetorical question. For both Democrats and Republicans, what is more important? The moral values stated in a 2,000-year-old document, the New Testament, or the moral values stated in the Bill of Rights or the 14th Amendment?
Yes, because that is a choice to be made.
And it is a stark choice. And our framers actually understood the choice. The New Testament is very clear. The founding fathers violated the New Testament in just doing the American Revolution, as I pointed out in an article for the Objective Standard. They did not render unto Caesar. They didn't pay their taxes. They did not turn the other cheek. They were not blessed peacemakers in just about every way you could. They didn't submit to the evildoer. More than that, in the book of the Bible, Romans 13, chapter 13, St. Paul makes it very clear that one must obey the government as God's agents on earth. That passage was used to justify the divine right of kings. That passage was used to justify theocracies. That passage has been used to justify socialism, Romans 13. So if it becomes an argument over whether it's the New Testament that has moral superiority over the Constitution or not, freedom loses, the Constitution loses, and it's just a solid case for which set of dictators you want.
Yes. And there's nothing better for sort of instilling a dictatorship that can survive over the long term. And this is something that Leonard Peikoff had pointed out, that if you have religion, then there is the promise of some salvation in the afterlife, goodies in the afterlife, because we all know what we all know. I think what history tells us now is that a totalitarian regime or a communist regime or a consistently socialist regime is not going to give you prospects for success and enjoyment in life on this earth.
Right.
We haven't seen it.
The secular leftists, like the Marxists, have their own version of heaven, only it's here on earth. It's the, quote, future. See, once we get through this dictatorship of the proletariat, once we go through these processes of dialectical evolution, we will somehow end up with the state withering away, and we'll end up in some nirvana where everyone will be on the intellectual level of Shakespeare's magically somehow. So Marxists have a mystical vision about the future, right, that very much resembles the Christian view of heaven. Just as environmentalists have a very religious view about nature being like a Garden of Eden that man corrupts. Both environmentalists and communists, socialists have a very religious view in that way, even as they accept Christian ethics, and Christian ethics are sort of built-in premises to their own thinking. That's just on the left. On the right, you'll notice how they make all those compromises with socialism and environmentalism, again, because of their biblically based values. So my fear is very much like Leonard Peikoff's, that a sort of a nationalist, right-wing brand of socialism and environmentalism based on the values of Christianity is, in the long run, the greater danger to America.
The greater danger. And the question is, it's a greater danger because both parties are converging in that direction, in a sense. So what we're actually calling right-wing now is maybe the Democrats are moving more towards it as well.
That is the way Trump is willing to work with Nancy Pelosi on things like the debt ceiling, infrastructure, drug prices, on everything that used to be something that a Republican would fight, at least give lip service about. Trump is willing to cut a deal with Nancy Pelosi and the Democrats because we all know those evil drug companies need to have those prices regulated. We all know we need a lot with big spending programs to help employment and infrastructure. And guess what? It really doesn't matter what government spending is or what the national debt is. We can cut a deal on that too. It shows Trump's lack of principle, but it also shows how the parties can converge and are converging on these basic issues.
Yeah, I mean, as I said, I've got this Shapiro tweet that I answered and I stuck it in the program notes. Elizabeth Warren had her tweet about economic patriotism, and she says a lot of giant companies refer to themselves as American, but let's face it, they only have one real loyalty, their shareholders. A Warren administration will halt the hollowing out of American cities and create good American jobs. Here's how. And then she's got her video, and I didn't even watch her video. I want to watch it. I would just barf. I saw the autoplay, and I saw the economic patriotism. She calls it that. Anyway, so Shapiro, this is what he writes. He says, "So glad Warren has joined MAGA." That's his, right? And my answer is, or maybe MAGA has joined the Democrats, right?
Right, right. Who's
This,
joined him first? Who outflanked who first?
who is joining whom? And it's all
Right.
becoming one indecipherable blob towards
During the
totalitarianism.
when people like you and I were saying that Cruz would be better, despite his religious values, than Trump, it was based on the idea that at least Cruz, like old Republicans, had some appreciation for the free market, some appreciation for freedom, some appreciation for the original constitutional system of America.
Freedom of speech. Yeah.
Has fulfilled all of our worst expectations in that regard. In terms of his tariff policy, immigration policy, orders to companies to leave China. He's throwing his weight around like an authoritarian.
Yes. And you can see, at least to me, why Hong Kong is, and the protesters in Hong Kong are the most inspiring thing going on in the planet right now. Because
Definitely.
here, what do we have in the United States? There are a lot of very bright people like Ben Shapiro who
One of the best
are,
conservatives out there saying,
yeah,
yeesh,
yes, and sometimes he's joking. Here he's not joking, right?
right,
There are certain of the policies of Trump that he's not strongly against enough, for my language is the thing.
right,
And in Hong Kong, by one estimate, there have been at least 1/7 of the population participating in protests, strongly objecting to being taken over. And it's over something that many of us would say, we had, framers or, people in the Revolutionary era who were out there doing the Boston Tea Party because of a tax on tea. I mean, how frivolous. Some people are saying, oh, well, why are all these people out there protesting on the streets and willing to incur violence based on an extradition bill? It sounds so
rioters.
arcane, right?
Yeah, they're troublemakers, rioters. Really, yeah,
No, but it's taking a principled stand against totalitarianism. And
exactly.
there is not anything like that fraction of the population here
Right.
realizing what writing is on the wall right now. And that's why, it's why you look to the people in Hong Kong. Those are really my people more than so many of the people here.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So,
No, when you see something like Hong Kong, they remind me of Israel, an island of sanity and civilization in a sea of nightmarish totalitarian or authoritarian, whether it's Marxism or Islamic madness. They are islands in seas of authoritarian medieval nightmares.
so we'll just keep trying to support them, and we will keep trying to speak out against all the unspeakable things here, and do what we do, right, James? So next week, would you be up to making this a regular Tuesday thing?
Sure.
Yeah.
What's best for you, Amy?
So
My schedule's kind of flexible.
Tuesdays noons. I hope that Tuesday at noon. I hope it works for people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Why not?
Let's keep going. People, if they want to support me, you go over to Patreon. I know I had talked about we were maybe going to do like a joint none of the above Patreon and stuff, but that maybe everybody should just have their own individual page. I know Euron's got his. By the way, when people donate to Euron's, none of it gets to me. He doesn't give me. So if you want to support me and what I do and all the crazy things I do, and I've written it up on my Patreon, kind of my pitch of what I've always done going back to year 2000. I actually was thinking about it. Year 2000 was when I wrote the friend of the court brief with Bob Getman for the Ilian Gonzalez case. And even before that, there was something I did by the way of intellectual activism. I took Leonard Peikoff's Healthcare is Not a Right speech. And this was way before I was ever involved with Leonard Peikoff, because that speech, I just was so electrified by it and thought it was such a wonderful, powerful speech. And I thought naively that if you just made every member of Congress read this speech, that, suddenly the whole
That's
socializing
that's
healthcare thing would just go away.
that's very,
So
very
I
says something
literally,
about the young Amy that I think is very positive, but somewhat naive.
so I actually did this. I took reprints of that speech and I sent them to every single member of Congress with a cover letter.
You.
That was one of the very first things. That's the first thing I can remember doing. So I've been doing stuff for years. I've been doing it with institutional support of various kinds, and now I don't have it. So if people, and in a way, it's kind of better, right? You funnel your money through an institution, it doesn't necessarily get to the people and the projects that you value. So if people value all of the diverse things that I've done, from, writing against Robert Downey Jr. getting forced into rehab, or, again, the Ilian Gonzalez, 9/11, I did this whole send out the bumper stickers with "Let's Roll." I was trying to stir up the good side of the patriotism that we had at that time. I was hoping George W. Bush was going to do a lot better, naively again. Uh,
Boy,
all
we were another instance of Peikoff prescience, right? Or objectivist prescience. Leonard was all over that. Iraq was the wrong war at the wrong time, and we should have long since been addressing ourselves to Iran.
Yep.
And look at the situation today.
Yep.
Iran has been and continues to be the main source of problems in Syria with ISIS, in Afghanistan, building nuclear weapons, schnookering us into deals. Iran is this. It just blows my mind. Today, where it is politically impossible, even most of the right don't want a war or even some kind of military conflict with Iran, even as they mine foreign ships, even as they take over.
Well, Trump said he's going to meet with the guy. Did you see that? Trump said he'll meet him.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Why not? He'll kind of deal with anybody, literally anybody.
Yeah.
We've had cause to go to war with Iran since the late 1970s when they took over our embassy. And yet our appeasement of them over and over and over has simply given moral support to, and I don't care whether they're Shiite or Sunni, has given moral support to Islamic extremists for the last 30, 40 years. And it started back when we let Israelis get slaughtered at the Olympics. It began when we allowed Iran to take over our embassy, and goes back to the 70s. And all of the Islamic terrorism that we have suffered since is a direct result of our spineless response to those things back then.
Yes. And of course, what is Leonard Peikoff when he goes on Bill O'Reilly talking about this? He's Dr. Strangelove if you suggest that nuclear weapons should even be.
But George H.W. Bush can go to war in Iraq, and it only makes matters better for Iran. And we got to be there and set up a good government, in a place that's very diverse. I mean, talk about the wrong war at the wrong time, especially when you're not taking on Iran. He has been vindicated by history, in my view, in spades.
Yeah. And I think I was also vindicated. I mean, you hate to make predictions for the future, but also just believing that Robert Downey Jr. could solve his problems via his work.
Right.
Look what a successful career he's made for himself now. It's amazing and a beautiful thing to see. So yeah, over the years, unfortunately, we couldn't do anything to help Ilian, and some of, who knows, some of the current things I'm trying to fight against might be similarly futile, but
we will try. All we can do.
We will try. So James, start your Patreon, and then everybody support James as well. I'm sure when you get it up. Huh?
Patreon, get on Twitter, and do all kinds of things, Amy, and I promise I'll get on it.
Awesome. Very good. So thank you, sir. I'm going to go ahead and end now. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in, and we will be back next week, same time. Take care. Here goes